Catherine Sénékis.
Catherine Sénékis will be speaking for the Hermès Foundation, and we will both be making some welcoming comments, and we'll give the floor to Romain Pirard, who was the real intellectual linchpin of today's work. But first of all, let me briefly actually repeat the importance of these annual meetings. We had one last year at another venue, at the Quai Branly, and then this year. These are meetings when we do some stock-taking look at, get status reports on biodiversity, and we hope to have different people in the audience, not only specialists, but we also would like to really broaden this overall debate to include other people as well. It's an important meeting for us, and I realized this from the feedback I got, the things I heard from others since the first conference we organized together, that this has had an impact above and beyond the conventional audience. So I'd like to welcome you to this second meeting of ours. I'd like to hand the floor over to Catherine Sénékis, and afterwards I will take the floor briefly before handing over to Romain, who will be talking to us about the intellectual thrust of the project. So Catherine has the floor. Thank you. I'd like to welcome all of you. Together with Laurence, we're very pleased to see so many of you in attendance. This is the third conference that the IDRI and the Foundation are organizing together. We began last year, in 2010, it was February, at the Quai Branly, with our first conference called Biodiversity 2010 and the Future. Then here in June, there was a second conference. The topic was biodiversity and property rights. So this is now the third conference. We're working in a partnership with the IDRI. Now, before talking about Hermès and why we have a foundation that's interested in the environment and more specifically biodiversity, I would like to thank Laurence. In 2008, she accepted to become part of, a member of our foundation's board of directors, and since then, we've been working together. And I hope for you, certainly for us, it's been a great source of enrichment. I think this may serve as an example of when a business gets together with researchers. People come together and become highly involved in lobbying international and working in the areas of international governance. All of us are highly aware of the important issues today. All of us are playing our own roles, working together. There's a real interdependence here. There's no doubt about that. So this coming together, this dialogue is very interesting. And let me say that Laurence has worked hard to lobby and network, and we've been working together hard, and every year we've further specified, worked on this dialogue between us, as well as we've worked out how the Hermès Corporate Foundation can position itself appropriately. Now, why is biodiversity an important topic? Why the environment? Specifically, simply because I believe we are responsible corporate citizens. So questions of sustainable development and how in our production, for instance, we can be part of the overall positive chain here on biodiversity, climate considerations, and so forth. We very much shoulder our responsibilities. We're doing this more and more. We're very interested in natural resources, going from the beginning, making of the product to its actual use and the consumer of the product. Hermès, as you know, is a company that makes various products using natural resources. So it makes perfect sense that we should be interested in these matters, since we really need to be generous and shoulder our responsibility, carefully think this through. Very important. So why did we establish a foundation? As I see it, a foundation is a place in a company that needs to be separate, proactive, working for the general good, an area where Hermès can demonstrate it's interested in know-how, yes, but it's also interested in helping the outside world and helping further knowledge more generally, which is why we have been really spelling out our commitments. So above and beyond these meetings, the conferences, the seminars, and the research we support at the IDRI, we've tried gradually to extend these commitments to cover various issues having to do with local know-how, local products, and biodiversity, maintaining it, and conserving biodiversity. I would like to thank the IDRI, IDRI's teams, and I'd like to thank all the speakers we'll be hearing from today who've accepted to come here, who really be explaining these points to us, giving us feedback on their expertise, and then we'll have interesting discussions. Thank you very much.
Merci Catherine. Dans ce partenariat,
in this partnership,
les fondations sont du mécénat.
Foundations are involved in sponsorship, patronage. There are various ways of organizing that patronage. And in our dialogue, the interesting thing to see is, and I don't want to encroach on areas for the Hermès company, which isn't part of what your foundation does. But what you do is try to consider how this line of business, this trade, and for those of you who are fortunate to sometimes be able to go into your building, and even more so, those who can go to the actual production plants can see the ancestral trades. They're at the very center of what Hermès does. And this is one vantage point, one way of viewing nature. And of course, this idea of looking at nature and its interaction with labor and production. This is very important for us at IDRI to look at that relationship when we're talking about conserving biodiversity. We're not a conservation organization of ecologists. We're a research institute that's interested in public policy and the interaction between people and the environment, natural environment, which of course, even in our countries and worldwide, is in a difficult position. So we want to look at this relationship between work and nature, production and nature. It's a perfect area that we should be looking into together, perfectly appropriate. Now, we realized that we needed to try to fully understand the value of these natural resources and their contribution to human activities, which is also why we've chosen today's topic for our debates. But before coming back to today's session as such, maybe I'd like to recall a few points. This is our third session. The inaugural lecture was also in a similar venue. It was lengthy and important, similar format. That was just before the year of biodiversity, the year that had led to the tripartite convention on biodiversity, which took place in 2010 in Nagoya. So there were various questions for that first conference at the Quai Branly, that beautiful venue, and our initial questions had to do with the validity of the objectives for the Convention on Biodiversity in terms of fighting erosion, and quantitative objectives, so specific targets for reducing erosion were mentioned. And throughout the day, the question had to do with their validity, i.e., can you decide on figures, actual quantities? Would that be a way of promoting action? To some extent, I don't know if they heard our thoughts, but in Nagoya, we did see that people who were working on this, politicians, experts, and so forth, policymakers, well, we really felt that at that conference, beginning of 2010, that there was a realization we had to change our way of viewing conservation. And then work during that day did have an impact and just showed that the community's level of maturity is raising, realizing that we can't only think of overall objectives, quantified reductions in erosion, and that would be fairly pointless. That would just mean surfaces protected or conservation rates or rates of erosion reduction. In Nagoya, what was really interesting was that we actually looked at the causes of erosion. Of course, there were objectives that were established. That's understandable. And internationally, what do? You decide on a legal framework. Everybody announces their commitments and tries to make them as binding as possible. So that framework for global governance has to, of course, entail objectives. But in Nagoya, they shifted these objectives. They weren't just sort of general, as though biodiversity were the same thing everywhere, and it's just some vague thing that you can deal with in a quantified fashion. But in Nagoya, they decided they had to look at the actual impact of human activity. Human activity, that's where you have to have objectives for change. And that was a major step forward that had been precisely discussed at our first conference. And various people alluded to this and continued working on it in their various networks, and this all sort of had its impact on policy making. So to some extent, we were heard. So I very much hope that today's session will have the same effect. At a time when people are almost obsessively talking about some of these points. It's very interesting, very important, and which is why we thought it was important to organize today's meeting obsessively about the idea of putting a value on biodiversity, finding some way of giving monetary expression to biodiversity. So that's why I want to talk about market-based instruments for biodiversity today. And Romain Pirard demonstrated this beautifully in the paper he did with Emma Breton, which is available, which is part of the intellectual underpinnings of our work today, which Idri is proposing to you. So we have the quantified objectives. That was sort of the objective of the convention. The idea was to look at, hectares of protected areas, percentages of erosion reduction, and so forth. Now we're seeing a new set of numbers arriving. The idea is that if you could come up with a value, a price tag on biodiversity, that would be a way of getting a fuller understanding of the complexity of the issue and actually acting on it, addressing it, which is why in many areas the question is, can we come up with a formula, instruments, tools that we could use so that we could actually put a figure, monetary figures on this value, the contribution nature makes to human activity. Now, it appears to me the question for us today, well, we need to nuance this and try to organize this, and that's the subject of the paper by Romain. So the question is, do we need actual monetary figures to understand and act, and moved from the private to individual? I mean, biodiversity is a whole set of ecosystems, varieties, genetic diversity, species, and so forth, when you look at the complexity of biodiversity. So can we move from the individual to the universal, from concrete to abstract? To do that transition, do we need figures? Yes, because using numbers, we can readily understand things and sometimes act on those things. If we do make a comparison with what's being done regarding climate change, that's the rationale that's pushing this forward. The idea is we can act on what's causing global warming. We use figures. We're inundated with figures, really, in this respect, both on values of carbon that would need to be reduced, and also quantified objectives that have to do with the scenarios for reducing emissions. So figures are useful. Are they enough to act? That's the open question. And also, I would say, if we try to use a monetary gauge to understand biodiversity and act on it to conserve it, is that useful? And is it enough? Is it sufficient? I suspect we'll find various types of answers to the question. And I know that since in January, it was in January, at any rate, last February, just as back then, we're trying to sort of look at things afresh. Start from scratch, not just be running with their pack and further adding to things that have already been done and said. Today, we're trying to emphasize the fact we need to find a solution to biodiversity decline. We have to try to measure services and put a monetary value on them. And I think we shouldn't leave it at that. That's not the only reasoning. We have to move on to other points. Biodiversity is important, and the values are important. You have to understand this, to understand the value of natural resources. But it's equally true that today we're living in a world where the leverage proposed by several surveys and studies, the TIBA report by Pavan Suglev, other work as well, papers that UNEP is working on and so forth, and other work that's been done on the subject. All of this shouldn't let us forget that they're only shedding light on part of the question and not the question in its entirety. So to repeat, will numbers serve us? Will they help us? Do we need to organize the numbers differently to understand them and act on them? And next, what do these numbers not cover, leave in the shadows, so to speak? I think that's part of the questions today. Romain has the floor. Oh, and a brief word. This partnership is very near and dear to my heart. It plays a special role. I don't know what we'll be thinking about next year, but let me just tell you, I think it's great for us to hear about the important topics from all of you. Now, I'm very keenly aware of the fact that the Hermès company is thinking about changes in the business, and it's thinking of cultural considerations, its place in society, lifestyle, and this impact the hand has on nature. And I think this is very important. It's about commercial endeavors, but it's more than that. It's not just market and commercial activities, but it's much more than that in their approach.
Je vais peut-être me mettre là, oui. Bonjour mesdames, bonjour messieurs.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
On va donc poursuivre cette session.
So to continue our introductory session, I'd like to make a presentation which will give the research findings we worked on in recent months to organize today's conference together with Emma Broughton. We're working on this idea of market-based instruments, which is today's subject for our meeting. Now, regarding what Laurence was saying just a moment ago, this link, the relationship between economic evaluations on biodiversity and ecosystems, and then decisions to manage the environment, that link, well, that's part of another research project which is funded also by the Hermès Foundation, which should be published in the next few months. Now, today we're going to be really working in 3 different sessions. The next session is going to look more specifically at various so-called market-based instruments. We'll hear from 4 speakers then. After that, we will consider the link with public policy more broadly, and specifically questions of legitimacy, equity, and effectiveness. After that, we'll have a session which will look specifically at some more controversial mechanisms, and we're going to try to also look at these in terms of overall effectiveness and see if these instruments can be justified. And then lastly, a roundtable session with people from research, policymaking, NGOs, who will be comparing their views and try to look toward the future together with us. Now, for my part, I would like to give you some background information. This is from an outline document that's also available outline on the IDRI's website. It's available there. I'm just going to look very briefly at some of the concepts here to try to set the backdrop for today's discussion so the audience can get a fuller idea of the various elements of this discussion. The concept of market-based instruments came to the fore quite some time ago. If we think back to the idea of taxing things, this has been on the agenda for quite some time. New instruments that were established gradually, such as more recently, for instance, certification-type instruments. The concept is something that's been discussed widely in biodiversity discussions, ecosystem services, and environment matters. And then the instruments are often applied as well, various forms used here, and they're often alluded to during discourse or scientific publications. An example here, in more general works here. Also then, there are influential reports such as the TEEB report, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report, which mentions specifically these market-based instruments. To my mind, this is precisely one of the reasons we need to be talking about these today.
Ok, on va faire comme ça, manuellement, à l'ancienne. Par contre,
Now, although these instruments are certainly very topical and important when it comes to the environment, I think there's something missing, a lack of clarity in terms of definitions for these. Often the definitions are fairly hazy, and there's lacking consensus as to the scope of these instruments and the way they are to be implemented. There are various interpretations, various ways of understanding these among the various stakeholders. By way of example, I'd like to mention work by Pagiola et al. That specifically deals with these market-based instruments, and the only definition they give us is that these instruments are designed to generate funds, either to increase private benefits of conservation for the private actors, which guides their decisions, or to generate financial resources that could then be used by private groups or public groups to launch conservation activities. But it doesn't give any more specific definition anywhere, so it's difficult to know precisely what the purpose is. And in my introduction, I'll just very briefly outline for you some of these instruments that are fairly widespread. We might begin. Oh, and also I wanted to mention parenthetically, when I mention instruments, I'm not actually saying whether or not they should be called MBIs as such. We can talk about that later. But anyway, one example may be Pigouvian taxes, well known to economists, conceptualized by a British economist, Pigou, who also talked about the concept of externalities, environmental externalities, i.e. the impact on the environment that isn't taken into account through market prices generally. So Pigouvian taxes, here's sending a price signal either to producers or to consumers to try to guide the decisions they make in the right direction. So the right direction would mean toward a social optimum. An example might be taxes on using chemical inputs in agriculture, so a tax designed to discourage farmers from using more of that type of input, which causes pollution. Next, you've got environmental subsidies, that area, governed by similar principles, the Pigouvian taxes, except it's the other way around. Here, what you're doing is trying to reward positive externalities, i.e. to foster virtuous practices. An example of an application here would be agro-environmental measures under the Common Agricultural Policy designed to have an impact on farming techniques. Then there's another category, very well known, payments for ecosystem services, or payment for environmental services or ecological services. There are various phrases used here. I'm sure we'll want to discuss those during one of our sessions later. I tend to talk about payments for ecosystem services. We can't delve into detail to make the various fine distinctions right now. So these instruments, these payments, this term, need to be viewed as a sort of broad principle, the idea of paying the supplier for various ecosystem services. But you can also understand this as being an instrument that you could define more specifically For people who work on forest matters, we could think of the definition by Wunder, the researcher who in 2005 talked about a precise definition according to which a contract would be signed between at least one beneficiary and one supplier, which would lead to the payment of a compensation if various terms were complied with. So the same term also applies to many different types of things, actually. It's also the case with later for the MBIs more generally. Another example of an application, mitigation banking. Mitigation banking, these are the result of applying a principle called the principle of no net loss. So no net loss. And according to this principle, the agent, the company that develops a project that deteriorates ecosystems, for instance, by building a road, then must restore another ecosystem or conserve it so that there's no actual net loss, no overall environmental loss, and specifically no net loss of ecosystem service. Now, we're not referring to the market here as such, but there are various ways of applying this principle. For instance, via a market where you can trade certificates, restoration certificates. So a land developer might not actually organize restoration him or herself, but actually go to a trading market exchange to buy these certificates. So you've got a market where you've got supply and demand for these certificates that are then traded. Theoretically, this should lead to the restoration at a lower cost, since there's an incentive given to seek the most appropriate land, for the best suited land for this. There's another instrument that I'll be coming back to later as well, but we're still in my introduction. Here I'd like to talk about certification, often on producers' initiative. So the system of certification is designed to sort of give a label to consumers that their virtuous practice is being used, and this can also be this can have an impact on prices. In other words, you might get an extra price, sale price, through certification. This can also help gain access to markets or increase companies' market share. The system of certification is going to be covered by a specific presentation during the next session. Now I'd like to talk about two questions that I think are very important questions for us to look at to get a fuller understanding of exactly what we're talking about when we talk about market-based instruments for ecosystem services. Firstly, we need to try to clarify the link, the real link there is, not the assumed link, the real link between these MBIs and economic theory generally, and more specifically, link with market dynamics, the way they operate, their characteristics, the pros and the cons in the markets, and so forth. A second major question, the relationship between the market-based instruments and public policy. Now, we realize that in the phraseology of market instruments, by using that term, we're suggesting some reduction of state commitment, i.e. sort of transfer of decision-making from the public sector, the administration of the government, whatever you call it, toward some private players. That's a second question we'll look at now. Now, as I said, I'm not going to delve into detail. I would like to give you some of the results of our analysis. We analyzed these instruments with an eye to economic theory, and what we've seen here is that the relationship between this diversity in instruments and markets is often a vague link. Fairly unclear and hazy. And in some instances, we could even go so far as to really wonder whether or not there is a link. Some market-based instruments do create new markets. Other MBIs use existing markets to trade relative prices. Others are based on signing contracts between a limited number of economic agents. So under economic theory, the market relationship is often questionable, and certainly there are many different types of market links. Next, probably really the only shared feature that we were able to identify, which really you find among all the instruments, all the MBIs, although again, I'm not saying whether or not these should be called MBIs, but that's just how they're termed in literature. So the only shared feature here apparently is that in one way or another, a price is assigned to nature. There are various ways of doing that, of setting that price, either by changing the market price or by establishing penalties to be paid by producers, or by organizing some compensation through contracts. Now, the next stage, to explain the emergence of MBIs, why they become important in our discussions. I think the reasons for their emergence isn't to be found in the marketplace, but rather the reason is because we're assigning a price, one way or another, assigning a price to nature through these various methods of intervention. When I talk about instruments, that's the idea here is English for policy instruments. We could talk about operating modes or methods or mechanisms in French. There are various terms you can use to cover this idea. We have to realize that. So the reasons, apparently, for the emergence of these MBIs, aside from the fact we're assigning a price to nature, I think there are three reasons for their emergence. Firstly, this way you can correct for what are called market defects, market failures, the idea that markets aren't really clearly reflecting all the various impacts. So supply and demand don't reach an optimum for society. That's the first thing. As a second reason, according to which this would be a way of applying the theory of incentives, according to which economic agents would be more likely to make the right decisions when they're given an incentive, a financial type incentive to do so, rather than if they were told to do so, forced to do so. Coercion, command and control type measures, coercive measures, rules and regulations. A third reason related to prices, which explains the emergence of these market-based instruments. This was very well discussed during the parties' convention for the Convention on Biodiversity last year in Nagoya. The idea is to make up for the gap, funding gap, the gap between the need for funding to limit biodiversity dwindling, so the funds needed as opposed to the funds that exist, particularly public funds. So they discussed various new approaches, new possibilities, innovative market-based instruments that could be used to make up for the funding gap. And the market-based instruments, by assigning a price to nature, are possibly a way of making it possible to make up for this funding gap by helping make sure private actors, above and beyond public players, make their contribution as well.
Donc prenons acte de la...
So let's look at these things. Obviously, we've acknowledged and established that there's some fuzziness about this in ecosystem services and systems. They're very various instruments, as we've said, and very varied. And by taking all this into account, I have tried to establish identify six types of MBIs. Now, this is a typology that is suggested, that will evolve and change over time. It's not set once and for all. And I'm sure there will be alternative typologies that could be suggested by focusing, for instance, on the effectiveness of these MBIs, or on fairness, or on the ability to expose information, or to mobilize intervention. But this being said, I wanted to establish my typology on the basis of economic principles. The first set is regulations that have an influence on relative prices as a function of environmental externalities. That set would include, for instance, the Pigouvian taxes and all sorts of subsidies. Then you'd have a second set. Those are what I call the quotient type agreements. This, in fact, refers back to Coase's theorem, which indicates that wherever the property rights are initially held, and provided the transactional costs are low, agents can semi-spontaneously, sort of spontaneously, exchange their rights and establish an optimum situation. Now, this would, for instance, include environmental services payments under Winder's definition. And in that is a sort of instance in which a beneficiary pays the service provider to improve the greater good. This is the sort of instrument that, in fact, is rarely properly implemented because it's fairly problematic. Then you have a third set, reverse auctions. This gives the opportunity for service providers to put a proposal or suggest a payment that they would receive for the service they would supply. This is usually as a reaction to a government urge and a program. This is what happened in Australia with the bush tender program, or in the US with the conservation reserve program. And in these instances, the government decides to ring-fence some ecosystem services and to reduce price as much as possible. The government asks the landowners to put in their bids. The bids are then, or the auctions are then compared to biophysical indicators and helps identify the most cost-effective lands to provide these services to. Then you have the fourth set, tradable permits. In that instance, what we're talking about is establishing an ad hoc market for the exploitation of a specific natural resource. The agents who want to exploit that resource will have to purchase rights from other agents who would in fact use less of these resources than they would be entitled to. One of the things we have, for instance, would be the individual transferable quotas in the common fisheries policy, or environmental mitigation banks, or transferable development entitlements in Brazil, for instance. And in Brazil, the fact is that landowners are not entitled to develop more than 20% of their land, the other 80% remaining forest land. But if they want to develop or exploit more, they can swap rights with other landowners who would exploit less of their land. So it's the usual thing. And this is something that we're familiar with in the climate change environment, because I think the cap and trade system can actually come under that heading. Fifth set, specific markets for environmental products. So what we're talking about here is not so much trading rights or entitlements, but actually trading an environmental product as such. This is usually done at the initiative of private agents, and in the biodiversity context, you could think at non-timber forest products, or at genetic goods, or even ecotourism. And in those instances, owners can in fact sell, or are in fact selling, the right to enjoy the landscape. The sixth category, the sixth set, is premium capture on existing markets. And that includes certification in forestry, for instance, with the FSC or the PEFC, or in farming, organic farming mainly. I think is rather self-explanatory, and also I haven't got much time, and there will be presentations on the issue later on anyway. The second question I mentioned earlier was, what's the relationship between these market-based instruments and public policies? It is true that MBIs in the heading actually seems to suggest that there's a weaker link with public policies than there would be with regulations. So you could think that the states are in fact withdrawing or being rolled back. This, in fact, really depends on what you mean by the phrase public policy or public policies. There are a number of ways to look at it. You could have a very restrictive view, for instance, the actions conducted by an authority in which public authority is vested, or you could have a broader understanding and say that it is the result of a multiplicity of interactions between various agents, both public and private. So it's a fairly difficult question and a very difficult answer. For the people who have the broader view of things, MBIs are policy instruments, whereas those who have a restrictive understanding of things feel that the question must be looked at. So what we've decided to try and focus on, therefore, is to try and identify the relationships between these MBIs and the public authorities and the public policies, and also look at how the decision-making process is or not being transferred from the public to the private sphere. So we'll look at three things. The definition of the major environmental targets and objectives. For instance, can we mitigate climate change? Then second set of questions, choice and design of instruments. Basically, how is this going to happen? And thirdly, the decisions on the ground. Are agents, private agents, afforded a greater choice? Which in fact might mean that there is some withdrawal from public policy by the authorities. Now, you'll find more details on the answers in the paper, but let me just jump to the conclusion and say that our report establishes and identifies very strong relationships between government systems and the MBIs at every stage: the design, the implementation, the regulation and monitoring, the sustainability of such MBIs also. But in fact, the relationship between the authorities and the MBIs really depends on what MBI we're talking about, which in fact echoes what I said earlier about the great diversity of instruments. The authorities are bound to be involved in the MBI's emergence and development, quite simply because public authorities are the only ones to have the legitimacy and power to promote such MBIs, that they can in fact serve as intermediaries when you're promoting environmental ecosystemic systems, and also they have the budgets that can cover the transaction costs, which, as we all know, are usually very high in the early stages. So this is the possibility of transfer from public to private decision-making. At the level of defining the objectives, for instance, should we reduce climate change emissions, or should we maintain, or how could we maintain ecosystem services for sustainable development? On these broad issues, there's almost no transfer of responsibility from public to private, which makes sense in a way, quite simply because most MBIs are derived from the objectives that are being set. Then there's some degree of shift, a bit more, but still not massive, on the designing and identification of the appropriate instruments. You could have some transfer, for instance, through advocacy or lobbying. And as we have, as we might see later on, the way in which MBIs are actually decided upon is something that we should maybe look at. And then there's the third set of questions I mentioned earlier. How are the decisions really made on the field, in the field? Well, that is really the context in which there's a very significant transfer of responsibility, and that makes sense from the point of the theory of incentives, quite simply because the MBIs are incentives to agents. So that really is what we see. Now, if we want to look a little further and a little more into the relationship with public policies, you can look at this relationship as a two-way street. The first way you can look at it would suggest or would require us to look at these issues from a governance point of view. The assumption here is that MBIs, or could be that MBIs, in fact, take over public policies. If you look at it from a governance point of view, as we've said, there's convergence between private and public actors who come together to solve a major societal problem, and therefore you have, in fact, some kind of institutional polycentrism and a variety of decision-making fora. So you could say that, obviously. And you could argue that MBIs take over the policies, as I said. But you could look at it from the other side and say that, in fact, public policies are taking over MBIs. And in that context, you could refer to new public management. And this is one way of explaining the emergence of a new culture within government, which is in fact increasingly resorting to private-style management. And this obviously would be delivery-based, result-based, and it would therefore make sense to have markets get involved. So you have a transfer from public to private, so that private agents can be a little freer in what they do. Okay, I think I've got about 3 minutes to try and wrap this up, so let me try and identify a few points. 4 main items I wanted to share with you. 4 takeaways, or take-homes. First of all, MBIs are, once again, as I have said, an extremely heterogeneous category. I had a chat with some of our speakers for today, yesterday evening, and some of them, in fact, challenged the way in which we had included some of these instruments under the broader MBI heading. So, significant heterogeneity, as I said, very varied situations, and the only commonality is that they fix a price tag on nature. What I have seen is that, in fact, giving a price to nature sort of leads to a to the possibility of commodifying nature, or rather enabling it to be traded. Now, giving a price tag to nature also means that there are a number of incentives that economic agents are now subjected to. Second conclusion. Precisely because of the variety of instruments in that category, I feel that you cannot assess generally the efficiency, the relevance, or the equity or legitimacy of all these MBIs. And you could also look at what Hahn, an economist, described a few years back. He was looking at the way economic instruments were designed in studies and offices, and identified that over time, as the instruments were being implemented, in fact, these instruments are not applied and used as they should from a theoretical point of view. So this might actually go some way to explaining the heterogeneity of these MBIs, quite simply because you have to adjust to local environments, local specifics, you have to take on board economic, social, or environmental concerns, etc., etc. The third take-home, I think, is that we should maybe look at developing more specific subsets that would be more standard, homogeneous, and therefore more relevant to study, and which could, in fact, bring more light to the decision-making process for policy makers. Now, as Sartori was saying when he was developing comparative sciences, he felt that for it to be worth comparing objects, these objects have to have sufficient numbers of shared exclusive properties. And in that case, only you can lead to generalization. And I would argue that that is not the case for MBIs as a whole, and we therefore need more homogeneous subsets. Fourth conclusion, MBIs are managed and steered by the public authorities, and therefore the transfer of decision-making process really applies to the agents and only to the agents on the field.
On va donc passer
Right, well, thank you for that. And let's now move on to the presentations for today. Xavier Leroux, Director for the Foundation for Research on Biodiversity, has been kind enough to agree to chair the next session, in which we will hear what Unai Pascual and Lars Gulbrandsen will have to tell us.